Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to this panel where Russell Watson and myself talk about media as a 21st century advocacy tool in the Caribbean, industrial schools, truth and reconciliation. My name is Marsha Hinds-Myrie, and I have been doing work around the government industrial school in Barbados, just trying to create more understanding around the issue as well as to really fight for legislative change to make sure that we're not, doing detriment to our children in the way that we have been. In this discussion today, I sit down with, like I said, Russell Watson. Russell is a lecturer in cinematography at the University of the West Indies Cape Hill campus. His areas of concentration are theater and digital imagery. He is the lead artist of our studio, a multimedia workshop that offers a wide range of photo, video, and graphic services to a diverse client base, including corporate entities, government agencies, theater companies, fine artists, and academics. And Russell became involved with the Government Industrial School project as a provider of his services. And this conversation that we are having today kind of it was a conversation that we'd had before about some of the issues around the government industrial school and the work that we were doing. And I said to Russell, this conversation could be one that is useful to other academics and other advocates who are also doing this work in other regions. And Russell graciously agreed for us to replicate this conversation. And I'm so thankful. And Russell, welcome.
Thank you, Marsha. Thanks for having me.
Now, one of the things that I always want to make sure when I'm doing the work that I do is that I'm doing it in a historically correct way. There are so many people who have fought for the rights of just us as Black people in the Caribbean for so very long. And sometimes we get caught up with the buzzwords, so we're talking now about grounded research and we're talking about community engaged research. But really, I think that there's always been a very strong tradition and culture of working in that way at the University of the West Indies. And so I feel as though I belong to this tradition in which art forms an important part of resistance and struggle, right? Beyond all of what we're talking about with buzzwords and that kind of thing. We've always done that as Caribbean people. Do you agree with that? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree totally. I think, for me, growing up in the Caribbean, my first engagements with art were, I guess, what we call now activist art or community-based development art, art that was focused on those kinds of objectives. One of my very earliest memories is going to what was then called Yoruba House for a performance, and I was maybe 4 or 5 years old, but experienced West African drumming and dance, and that that was very much part of my growing up, and it wasn't until I was much older that I realized how transgressive a space that really was. And that work was, mirrored and compounded by what was going on in the Calypso tents. The lyricists in the Calypso tents, the Calypsonians have always been identified as people who are speaking of the social climate from an individual perspective. It is protest aestheticized. We find it in poetry and theater, as I said, in dance and performance. I think of, one of the earliest poets that I encountered and became fascinated with as a young teenager was Martin Carter, who ended up going to prison for his words, right? So this is a long tradition in I would say art in general. I think art has a protest imperative. because it does speak the unspoken in a way that I think journalists and news agencies, and what we're going to talk about today, documentarians don't have the opportunity to do, simply because you have the disguise of fiction, right? So I think of things in Barbados like Pampalam and Laugh It Off that satirize political power every single year. I think Pampalam has been going for 40 years or something. Laugh It Off. And you'll find iterations of annual review shows like that all through the region. Of course, they're becoming less and less now, but I think that's probably because of some of the things that will come up in our talk today about the way in which advocacy and activism are becoming increasingly silent.
Yeah. I think many people who know about the work that I'm doing around government industrial school know that I started out as the deputy chair of the school. And I had not known a lot about what was happening in the school before, I took on that position. And about 2 years into my tenure, one of the things that always was very shocking to me was how little people actually knew about the government industrial school and what was happening there. And this got me interested more in documentary and media that people were actually interested in and going to, right? There is a way that a documentary can do far more than an esoteric academic essay. I realized that I could write a million essays about what was happening at the government industrial school as an academic and still not reach an audience. Talk me through the process then of creating a documentary on a subject like government industrial school and how you are able to bridge the gap between academic knowledge, and that kind of thing, but also just appealing more to the public.
Yeah, there's I think documentaries occur in a variety of forms, and I think where we are now in our media landscape with social media, we are not really thinking about documentary practice as a singular media stream, but rather as perhaps a singular media source that streams out onto multiple platforms. And so you're not thinking about this kind of logical timeline of, here's the beginning and this is the exposition, but you're engaging in a more what some theorists call a transmedia approach, where you are engaging with the audience from several directions at the same time. But traditionally, documentary was really just that, is that you set up the camera and observe. But very quickly, filmmakers and film theorists, once they started to investigate the impact of edited images on human perception, documentary started to evolve. And what started to take place was this notion that documentary was not neutral, that documentary was inevitably biased, whether it was biased based on the filmmaker's perspective or based on the entity that was funding the documentary. So the very notion of truth or in representation in documentary became a big question very early on. Mm-hmm. And so what that opened up was an opportunity to be idiosyncratic and very individual in the documentary voice. So, we still see documentaries that operate on a more expository kind of platform where, you have this voiceover that is telling you these are the facts, right? And then there are other types of documentaries that are a lot more comfortable with leaving the question of the factual nature of the images presented up to the audience, so those are the kind of two polarities. And then, between there are, multiple approaches. But I think with something like what is occurring with the girls' industrial school, that the facts become incredibly important. And so this is where, if I'm understanding your question correctly, is that there's a bridge between art and academia. And I think it is really about a relationship between fact factual information and something that will be, for want of a better term, entertaining enough to capture the attention of an audience that would not normally engage with the subject matter.
Absolutely. And I think that's why, and I think, again, like we've said before, historically and culturally, Caribbean people like storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
Caribbean, there's a way in which, like you said, the calypso tents and that kind of thing, that is where we go to have our discussion, right? So
Correct.
when I think of people like Tajay Henry, and people who articulate very clearly that Caribbean philosophy is embedded, right, in our dance and in our music. And I think that is why I'm so fascinated about documentary and what we are hopefully going to create around the government industrial pool.
Right.
But even as we think about doing that now, and this was the part that you were very helpful in making me focus on, the law around that and just some of the things that we're going to have to surmount to be able to do the work that we want to do.
Yeah.
Tell me some reflections about the law.
So yeah, I think this is a great concern because well before our current digital moment, there was an issue with defamation laws, right? And the kind of broadness with which those laws could be applied. And so you have, laws that are in Barbados, for example, with regard to stage presentations. I started out in theater, and one of the things that we had to deal with early on was the fact that you are not allowed legally to represent a police officer on stage. You can't dress a character as a police officer. So it means then that if you're trying to make a piece that has any sort of, not even necessarily critical perspective on the police, but it could be complementary, is that you don't have the opportunity to even represent their personage, which immediately draws up some red flags and offers up problems for public analysis, right, of a figure like that. Mm-hmm. But now with our current digital moment, what we are really confronting is the broadness with which the cybercrime and communication laws are being shaped. I am not a legal expert, so I wouldn't go I can't go as deeply into it as I think we will need to in our process. And this is why I, have strongly recommended to you that, you get a legal support team on your side, is that it's from the conversations that I've had with lawyers and journalists about this issue in particular, it seems that the application of laws and the ability to charge someone with libel or harassment or defamation is pretty broad, and it really does boil down once again, as in some ways it should, to one's ability to prove your facts, right? But I think this is where, art in the public space versus activism in the courtroom start to separate, is that, the thing about the girls' industrial school is that, everybody knows, you know what I mean? Everybody knows. Yeah. And so what we don't have is a collective confirmation of what we know, which is what art can do. So art does that, and it opens itself up to the aggression of the law. But what it does as an activist, as a transgressive act, is that it makes this knowledge publicly, collectively acceptable, right? And so it then puts the burden on the person being accused or the entity being accused to defend themselves. But if we wait for those kinds of activist moments to occur in the courtroom, well, our court system is laborious in the least, right? So something that is as urgent as the subject matter that you're engaging with, there are big questions about whether the court is the right place to begin this journey of public awareness and public action. So I think, yes, you are making the right choice of engaging with an art practice as your output for this, beyond your academic work, that you're finding a way that it becomes more accessible to the public. But just as I said, keeping in mind that, legally we are walking a very tight rope, and we just want to make sure that we're sure about it.
It's so interesting that point you make about, taking what we all know collectively,
Mm-hmm.
but giving it a very public gaze. Because when I chose to whistleblow on the naked girl in the cell, my way of putting it, and it was a phrase that somebody had used to describe Andy I when we lost her in Guyana. It was said that Andy I was just the conscience of Guyana.
Right.
And when I whistle blew, I was like, I'm going to the national conscience. I'm going to the public so that enough people can say that this is wrong for it to stop. Because I had tried, many other ways of doing that before then. So it's just interesting when you talked about that. It really.
Yeah, and I think, I'm glad you bring up Guyana, because Guyana in its difficult years, not that its time has become, significantly less burdened, but in its, recognizably difficult political years, there were artists there with very strong backbones, right? That had an immense courage to speak up. And I think this is where, we are challenged right now in finding that courage, in one way, because I think, especially during that immediate post-independence period in the Caribbean, I think the sense was that the powers that you were pushing against were foreign powers. It was the legacy of colonialism. Whereas in our current moment, we are really pushing against ourselves, right? And so the conversation becomes a lot more difficult. It's like the difference between cursing out your neighbor and cursing out your sister.
Absolutely.
Right? But I do believe, like you said, is that there is a public conscience, and that the public conscience, once it is engaged and informed, will act. And this is where, and we've seen it over and over. One of my favorite people is the mighty Gabby, right? And it's interesting to me that Gabby has become a cultural ambassador for the country, because when I was growing up, every single year Gabby would get banned every single year, right? And his songs did have very significant public impact, right? One of his more famous songs is "That Beach Is Mine," right? When there was this attempt to change the policy around beach access for the public. And he sang this song and brought the issue into the public consciousness. And therefore, there was no politician that could play their political game and stand on that side of the fence. And so he, so it is a question of that kind of courage and faith in the public conscience, I think.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting because the last question I'm going to ask you now is about possibilities of art and activism and art activism in the Caribbean. And so it's interesting that you invoked Gabby just there. What do you think are the possibilities, Russell? Where are we going?
Well, I mean, where media is going is, it is moving so quickly right now. In terms of the types of platforms that we have, the types of interface that we have, and as well the type of restrictions that we have. One of the most, I think, concerning issues that we have with the technology is bandwidth, right? We kind of assume that everybody has access to the internet, but they don't. Right. I mean, I was in school when this whole digital revolution, really started to kick up dust. And, even back then, the conversation was about the digital divide, right? And what we were going to observe sociologically as a result of this difference in the degree of access. So while something like this could get out there, the question of where it is going to get to, as well as the laws that govern its ability to move through the internet. There's also this idea that the internet is a quote unquote free space, and it is not. It is hyper curated, right? Of course, the visibility of that curation has become more and more visible in the last couple of years, so people don't really lean into that as much. But I think even in terms of, you know, the business community, when they think about, you know, internet marketing, you know, the assumption is as well, if I put it on the internet, people are going to see it. And it's like, no, you know, you have to really have this back end strategy with affecting the algorithms to make sure that your media is seen. So I am hopeful in one sense, because what social media does provide is that it provides independent distribution in a way that I don't think we have ever seen before. And it is as transformative as the Gutenberg press and as, you know, the Eastman Kodak box camera, and how that changed the way we transmit information. But I'm also, as I said, you know, very, very concerned about the legal framework in which these technologies exist. And you know, I'm not a lawyer. I'm an artist, right? I engage with the law, but that's not my area. And it is concerning to me that I'm not hearing more engagement from the legal fraternity on this issue.
Russell, I want to thank you so much for taking some time out of your schedule to have what I think is a very important conversation with me. I want to also thank Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard and Sapia and the entire RCYP organizing committee for allowing us this small space. And I now take the opportunity to open the floor to questions. Thank you.